Joining me now from Novak Education in the US is Dr. Christopher Bronke. Christopher, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for having me. I love joining these conversations, and to be hanging out with you all in Australia, like what an honor. So I appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you indeed. We're here today to talk primarily about a sort of big picture overview of understanding universal design for learning and how it benefits learners. But before we do, can you tell us a little bit about your background in education and how you came to do what you're doing now?
Yeah, so I'm about to finish up my 20th year in public education as a high school English teacher. For all of that, the last 12 has been teaching a class and also being a high school English department chair in a school of 24 to 2,200 students, depending on the given year. So the staff that I oversee or have been overseeing is like 20 to 22 English teachers, so a good size, it's comparable to some schools, entire school. And for me, I was really blessed throughout my career to have some amazing mentors. Janice Schwartz is one I just want to shout out because I always like to give some love to the people that brought me to the spot. She was my first year of high school English teacher when I was a student.
Wow.
Then she went on to hire me as a teacher. We were department chair colleagues, and then she was eventually my principal at one point in time. And I've just, really taken a passion for literacy in particular, and I use that in the most broadest sense as possible. And then Dr. Katie Novak, who's the founder and owner of Novak Education, and one of the foremost minds of universal design for learning in the entire world. She and I met probably 10, 11 years ago doing some work for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And we stayed in touch. And as her consulting work continued to grow, so did my role with her. And so I'm actually about to finish my last year in public education and move full-time as a senior educational consultant with Novak Education starting essentially May 24th when the school year wraps up for me here in Illinois. So it's been a journey.
It sounds like it. And what was your doctorate focusing on?
So my doctoral dissertation work was all around standards-based grading. I'm a huge proponent of blowing up traditional assessment programs and pathways. I think grades are not really the way to go. That actually really paired beautifully in a lot of respects with universal design for learning. Because when we think about removing barriers, right, the traditional grades can be a barrier for a lot of kids. And so as I started doing more work with Novak Ed and more work around and both learning more about, but also then sharing more about universal design for learning, I realized just how deeply entrenched this idea of standards-based grading can really be a foundation that works well with all that. And so it was a win-win for everyone. But my focus in particular wasn't just standards-based grading, but it was how teachers can move to standards-based grading despite working in a system that is still traditional grades. Because that's my own classroom. My own classroom has been standards-based grading based for 5 years. But I still have to give grades at the end of the day. And that's where most educators who want to make this move live. Like at the end of the day, their principal still tells them like, hey, buddy, like you got to put an A, B, C, or D, and F when in the grade book. But there are ways to still navigate the entire year, semester, quarter, whatever sort of system people are on. We just need to figure out how to get more people to do it.
Well, just perhaps to help bridge maybe the contextual divide between Australia and education and American education, here in Australia, similarly, we have a nationally mandated need to have A, B, C, D, or E grades on our reports, but then every state or territory is kind of left to interpret that to a certain degree, how they implement it. What does it look like in your teaching context, and how does your notion of standards-based grading differ from that?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that question in that context. I think we're similar in a lot of respects. I mean, everyone still has to give those actual letter grades, especially someone who works in the high school setting. The colleges want to see those grades, and there's all those sorts of pieces. For me, what it really came down to was taking a step away from thinking about school and learning in terms of grades, and in terms of percentages. And I think there's layers there, right? There's letter grades, there's percentages. You can use both. One can lead to the other. You can use one without the other. And really just saying, like, here are the 13 things I want to make sure I know my students learn by the end of this term. And for me, I just use a 1 point scale. 1, you learned it. 0, you didn't. And then I just have a conversion chart that says, in order to, because I still have to put a grade in the grade book, right? So at the end of the semester, it's like, all right, to get an A, you have to have gotten a 1 or mastered everything, and so on and so forth. And you work yourself down. But we're not talking about, the conversation with students isn't, which I heard for many, many years in my career, Mr. Bronke, I got an 87 on this paper. What do I got to do to get a 90? Which everyone has heard if you work in any system that has to give grades, right? Or, will you round up my 89.4? My conversations are, you told me I still didn't master standard X. What else do I need to do to show you that I can do that? And it's like, okay, cool. Like, show me everything you got. So it becomes less about assignments and grades and more about like just showing me the evidence that you can do X, Y, or Z.
Oh, excellent. Sounds really interesting. I mean, there are certainly similar conversations happening around Australia about how we move beyond our grade scale, if we're ever allowed to.
Yeah, same. This is not far reaching. I'll put it that way. I'm in a microcosm of microcosms, but I'm hopeful.
Well, I'll be interested to discuss a bit later on how that connects to some of the principles of universal design for learning. But to start off with, can you how do you describe universal design for learning for someone who's hearing about it for the first time?
Yeah, I mean, I've got a couple of different ways that I try to frame it when I'm working with staff. I think the most macro level is when we universally design, we are, as the designers of the learning experience. And I say that, I don't say just the teachers, the designers. That could be teachers, curriculum designers, instructional coaches, assistant principal, and anyone who has any hand in this work. We are doing everything we can to remove every possible barrier we can think of for every single student that we can think of, so that everyone has the most equitable choice and chance at success for their learning. That's the macro level picture of it, right? And I know that sounds really pretty and like unicorns and such, but it's achievable when you then start to break it down into what does that mean, right? Like, it's not like this is an unresearched or developed concept, but in short, how to remove every possible barrier for every possible kid.
And how does the universal design for learning, well, I'll just refer to it as UDL from now on, but how does the UDL approach achieve that goal without it becoming, I think one of the most common, I don't know if the word myth or misunderstanding is the most accurate, but one of the most common things I hear people say in opposition to UDL is, I'm not going to plan 30 lessons for 30 students. So what principles does UDL incorporate that doesn't make it 30 individual lesson plans to meet all those needs?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of ways to approach that. I think one is from the team planning lens. And that would be like UDL without PLCs or professional learning communities or some sort of like team time on the regular. It is hard. There's no doubt about that. So, the district in which I work over the last couple of years, we've pretty much all but gotten rid of common planning time for grade level teams or PLCs. That makes this really hard. And so there's at the most macro level, like, if you aren't going to commit yourself as a district or a school to saying teachers are going to get X amount of time per week or every other week to do this work, you're going to struggle to get this work to grow because there is a labor lift to it. And you know what? Good practices should have a labor lift to them, but they should also have the time dedicated to that labor lift, right? So like my first point is like teachers have to have dedicated PLC, even if you don't want to use the PLC term, whatever term you want to use, teachers need that time. The second thing that I like to talk about too is there's a phrase, and I'm going to give two iterations of this phrase that we kind of use in the UDL world. Like one is what is needed for the few is good for the many.
Mm.
And so if you think about that conceptually, and I'll give a quick analogy. 15 years ago was like my third, fourth year teaching, something like that. I had a student who had a visual impairment. And this was before I could just put everything on Google and just like change font size and all that sort of fun stuff, right? So like I had to go to the copy machine, like anything we were going to read, I had to go enlarge on the copier. I did that for that one student because that was what that one student needed. Who was I to think I didn't know if that would have been good for other students? How many more students might have realized that they actually could read better with a larger font size?
Mm.
I mean, heck, how many of those students actually might have also had a visual impairment, like diagnosable visual impairment, that they didn't have the funds, means, or possibilities to figure out they had, but had I given them that, enlarged font, they would have been like, Bronke, like reading is so much easier right now, right? And I look back on it, I'm like, well, if I was going to do it for one, why didn't I ask other people, right? So like what is needed for the few, we used to say is good for the many. And that's a case where it could be. But there's also like now a caveat on that, like what is needed for the few can be good for the many. Because there are also some accommodations that, is needed for the few that actually could hurt some students. And so it's not an absolute, but this idea that if you're working in a classroom that has any sorts of like inclusion where there are students with special needs involved in it, whatever you're doing for that student, consider how every student might want, need, or could use that and go from there. And so I don't look at it as 30 individualized educational plans. I look at it as just thinking about like, what are the biggest needs? And then how do I scale those needs for everyone? And when we start to do that, we can really unlock a lot of pathways for a lot of learners.
Well, can we then talk broadly about what are the key design or learning design principles that underpin UDL to help scale those needs or meeting those needs?
Yeah, so there's like two pockets of three in terms of how I conceptualize it. And this isn't just me, but like this is me taking all of the research from CAST and from Novak and all the different people. And like, this is how I synthesize it. I think there are like, here are our goals, and then here are how we try to go push for those goals. So the three big goals or like concepts or the framework are, we believe in variability. That at any given moment, not only is every student different from every other student, but that each individual student in any given moment can be different than they were just 5, 10, 12, 15 minutes ago. We are variable humans. And I think the more that technology infiltrates, and I don't use that word infiltrates with a negative connotation per se, but as technology infiltrates the educational environments, that variability within each student is exponentially greater than it was 10, 15 years ago. The number of times I will see a student in my class, for example, check their cell phone, and then you can visually just see them be a different disposition than they just were because mom texted them, dad, girlfriend, best friend, coach, someone sent them something that like now has them as a different human than they were 5 minutes ago. So the first thing is UDL, we embrace that idea of variability. The second thing that we this is the one that you have to hammer home to have success across a district, because a lot of teachers are going to say, oh, you're just trying to make learning just super easy for everyone. It's like, no, that's not what we're trying to do. We believe...
Sorry, do people who say that ever explain why that's a bad thing?
Well, and that I also push back on that, which I'm about to do right now, and how I explain this. Yes. So we do want to make learning easier for everyone, but not by lowering the standard. And so the second principle for UDL is that we have firm goals with flexible means. So the goal isn't changing. If you feel like you're using UDL and it's making the goal itself lesser, that's on you and not holding yourself as the educator to that high standard of that goal. The goal of, that should not change. But all of the ways our students can get to that goal should. And yes, does that make it, quote, easier? Yes, but it doesn't make it less rigorous. Like those aren't synonyms. We can have an equally rigorous goal with less resistance to achieving it. And so that's the second principle. And then the third principle is we just want all of our students to be expert learners. We want them to not be experts in their contents or not experts in specific disciplines. If that happens, that's fantastic. If a kid leaves my class and they want to go write haiku poetry because that's a passion of mine and it became a passion of theirs, awesome. I'm not, waking up each morning praying for that to be what ends up happening, right? We want them to be experts of their own learning. We want them to know how they learn. I know your podcast, I was looking into some of your work. You're big on what's the research out there. One of the big tenets that UEL is kind of centered around is this idea of pushing back on what for years had been the arc of educational, lesson and unit planning. And that's this idea that there are learning styles, right? That there's the auditory learner, that there's the visual learner, there's the kinesthetic learner. And you know what? The American Psychological Association, they debunked that. And they didn't debunk it in that we don't learn in different ways. But what they said is no one person is one sort of learner, right? What we do is we learn how we learn. And so I know if I'm in a math class personally, I actually am I want a lecture. I don't want to go play with manipulatives in a math class because I will not figure that out, right? And in my English class, which is my specialty area, I want to go play and I want to actually be active. I want to be moving around and letting the moment speak to me in terms of that sort of thing. And so it's not that we don't have moments in which we are kinesthetic or auditory or visual type learners. It's that we are all of those. And what we're trying to do through UDL and by removing barriers and by supporting their reflection and their own development of learning is get them to best learn when they are which type of learner in which situations and how to do something with that.
I also think, sorry, just to go back to one of the things you were describing there, I think also that idea of making learning easier without changing the standard is probably the most succinct description of the process of scaffolding that I think often gets misunderstood. You know what I mean? And often you see things that are meant to be considered scaffolds or aids becoming the goal rather than the stepping stone to the goal. So I just think that the way you described it there is a wonderfully succinct explanation of how scaffolding is meant to work as opposed to how it often gets implemented.
It's funny you mentioned that, Cameron. I just literally was filming a content video 20 minutes before popping on here with you about scaffolding, about using graphic organizers. And I said explicitly, the goal isn't I can fill out your one graphic organizer, right? The goal is I can learn how to get my mind to get me to a point to develop content specific to the task and audience of the purpose. And that's 1000%. And I think one of the big things with scaffolding as a whole, specifically graphic organizers, when we think it through the UDL lens, is that most teachers give, here is the one, if they give one, here is the graphic organizer, as opposed to here's the visual graphic organizer if you want to do some sketching work. Here's the linguistic one. Here's the traditional outline, right? That you could write your graphic organizer, right? And here is your verbal one. You want to just go on a quick walk around the hallway and record your thoughts for what you're planning to do with this content creation. All of those are things we all go through. I mean, I use all three of those in my content creation. And that's just one quick example. When you mentioned scaffolding, those are all scaffolds. But if we're only giving students one of them, we need to ask ourselves why some of the students aren't using it, because, well, maybe it doesn't work.
It's not for them.
Right.
Yeah. But then, so what are some of the when we've described the three key principles that you've said underpin UDL. What is the practical manifestation of those when you're trying to plan a lesson to account for the variability that you mentioned? What are the key strategies? And you mentioned CAST before. Just for those who aren't familiar with CAST as well as Novak Education, do you want to just give us a quick background on them before we move on?
Yeah, so I'm blessed to work for Novak Education, so I'll start there. Dr. Katie Novak, author of, I think she's up to 14 books or something like that. Check her out, UDL Now, UDL for Equity. She has a wide range of books that will cover this topic. And we as an organization, consult with districts, organizations, states, countries, whoever is looking to work on this, these concepts. And then CAST is sort of like the mothership company that created the guidelines and has all the technical stuff. And I don't mean technical stuff as in a negative way that maybe sometimes it can sound. The brilliant research. They are the ones who assembled the body of research. And if you go to their website, you can go to one of their pages where they will give for every single micro principle of UDL. Here's the research. Here's the research. Here's the research. So, and CAST and Katie Novak, the two orgs actually work really well together. We're blessed to collaborate a lot too. So yeah.
Well, the reason I picked up on your mention of that was because I think I have most commonly seen, apart before I started reading Katie Novak's books, I had most commonly seen the CAST little matrix of lesson applications, and I'm just wondering which one of those, or how do those principles help address the principles you've just outlined?
Yeah, perfect. That's such a great segue into it. So if you look at their matrix, and it's beautiful. I'm not going to put this in any way, shape, or form and at all critical, but when I look at that, it's still somewhat scientific. There's language there that, at least for me, when I first started doing this work, which I should say, Katie brought me on the team because I was doing UDL without even realizing it. And then she's this. So I actually learned about Katie after doing it wasn't I went to a workshop and then I revised. It was this feels like good teaching. And then Katie was like, hey, this works. And then I kind of learned the terms. But as I was learning the terms, I was like, I don't know, as a teacher, I don't talk like that, right? And so I try to, if for those of you listening, you can go to CAST, you can find their matrix. It's beautiful, it's super interactive, and it's really helpful. But here's how I break it down in most simplistic terms. If we want to achieve those three goals I just talked about, right? This idea of, embracing variability, the firm goals, flexible means, and the expert learners. There are three types of barriers in the way for our students. And this is where I just try to kind of talk as a teacher, right? Or how I think as a teacher. There are barriers for how students engage with the learning. There are barriers for how students actually get the learning and do the learning. And there are barriers to how students demonstrate the learning. And so when we sit down as a common team to plan, we don't have to worry. I mean, we can and we should dive into the research if we get time for it. But Cameron, common plan time for teachers is so finite, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
The amount of time that we actually have to go dive into the beauty that is the robust nature of CAST's website, it's not always there. And so I like to just say hey, here's the quick summation. When you're planning lessons and units, just ask yourself those three questions. What barriers are there for how kids are going to engage and stay engaged? That's the harder part. How are they going to learn it? Is there more than one way? That's always the question I ask. If you only have one way for kids to learn it, we got to be better, right? And then same with demonstrating. When they get ready to demonstrate the learning, if there's only one way, we've got to be better. And so those three kind of quick barriers are just nice, I think, for me at least, teacher-friendly ways to work through a really robust research-based concept in a really practical time.
It reminds me of a common sort of summarized model, a phrase for differentiation that's also often promoted as a way to offer options for gifted, high potential and gifted students as well, which is a choice of content, choice of process, or choice of product. And I see that sort of reflected a lot in the way UDL approaches lesson design as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I 1000% agree with that, and I think that framework is they're synonyms right there. I mean, that kind of the same framework. It's interesting, and I don't know, Cameron, if this is not where you want to go with this, but you mentioned differentiation. I think it's really important if we have a few minutes for me to kind of talk about.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because a lot of times what we get when we start working with teachers, like, well, but I differentiate all the time. And I say, well, that's great. You should be, like, good. But those aren't synonyms. Like, universal design and differentiated instruction are not synonyms, and we need them both. And here's how I like to frame it: if we don't universally design from the start, the data with which we are going to try to differentiate is flawed. And so I'll give you a quick example. If the only way a student of mine had to learn about plot structure was through an article that I gave them, and the only way they had to demonstrate that knowledge of plot structure after that article was through a quiz, Cameron, you might be illiterate and hate quizzes and get a 0. And I'm saying to myself, Cameron knows nothing about plot structure. What is going on? But really, Cameron just can't read. And if I had given Cameron an audio version of that learning material and the chance to verbally share with me what he learned about plot structure, it's not saying he's going to be 100%, but you might understand most of plot structure, but your data that you're giving me now is like, ooh, he gets just about everything, but he doesn't quite understand the importance of the climax. So my differentiation is now pointed to that. But if we don't universally design up front, there are so many other variables and barriers at play that it's impossible for me to know what actually I'm differentiating on. Am I differentiating on because you can't read? Am I differentiating on because you didn't understand the content? Am I differentiating on because the content was boring to you? Am I differentiating on because the way that you had to demonstrate the concept didn't work for you? I don't know. So I'm guessing. And so I'm doing DI, but to what extent and for what purpose? So we need both, is what I'm saying. Like, we really, really, like, UDL doesn't replace DI, but DI is not super effective unless we've universally designed first.
Although, just to clarify, I know that you were talking about differentiated instruction, but just to clarify, when you say DI, you're meaning differentiated instruction, not direct instruction, because for a lot of our Australian listeners, there's a big debate about explicit and direct instruction going on right now. So those initials getting thrown around in different contexts.
Yeah, Cameron. So again, if we can, yes, I was meaning differentiated instruction for that entire little diatribe I just went on.
Yeah, I was just clarifying.
And I appreciate that. But we can also universally design direct instruction. I think one of the myths of UDL is it's like, oh, I can no longer direct instruct.
Yeah.
Not at all. Like, if you were to come to a Novak workshop, whether it's me or Katie or Mirko or like any of our consultants, like, we do stretches of direct instruction, but we're universally designing that direct instruction by giving you multiple ways to take notes during it, by giving pause points where you can talk and turn and or reflect. And in your reflection, you can write, you can draw, you can chat. We're building in those pieces. No one is saying that the teacher at the front of the room is going by the wayside. We just want to see that reconceptualized so that all of our learners' needs are met when that teacher is at the front of the classroom. So that is one pushback we get sometimes, like, oh, DI or direct instruction is now a thing of the past. You're telling me that, like, I don't ever get to teach again. It's like, no. But if you were to keep these things in mind when you think about the barriers that could be there for kids, I think about this all the time. I used to direct instruct, in my early career without giving students different ways to take notes and so on and so forth. And I would write on the board, Cameron, I've got the handwriting of a 3-year-old chicken. I don't know how any of my students were actually able to take the notes that I was giving them. As I reflect back on it, that's my own, I was bad. So direct instruction can still be there, but we can universally design that direct instruction.
Could we just really zoom in to help people understand then? So if when you are universally designing a lesson, you've managed to make the stars align, and there's a faculty planning session to plan, whether it's a unit of work or even just the lessons for the next couple of weeks. When you are sitting down to actually plan that lesson, you've mentioned incorporating different ways of students engaging with and representing information. Even if we're not planning 30 different lesson plans to meet 30 different student needs, what are we planning to make sure that we are meeting all of those needs without it becoming the creation of possibly, I think another one of the myths or another one of the pushbacks I've heard very commonly is that idea of creating resources or work or lesson activities that are not going to be not necessarily going to be used, or that might be redundant, and people seeing that as sort of a wasted time or effort. So what actually goes into planning to make it both effective and time efficient?
Yeah. So I think I've never used this phrase before. So debuting this as we go, because I kind of, as you're talking, I'm thinking about like all the ways I think about this. I think about it as like a 3-2-2. So 3 is that we have engagement barriers. So if we do one of these 3 things in every lesson, we will help break down those barriers. That is, have students self-reflect, have students self-assess, or have students self-engage or rethink, like in their own language, the learning goals. So one of those 3 things. One of the biggest things with engagement, and I'll go off this on a quick little tangent and I'll come back for a second. We think macro level, holistic, we in education, we think of engagement as a visual thing. I know kids are engaged because I see the head nods and the smiles, and that's affirming and it's beautiful. But you know what? I can smile in my head nod way through the best of PD sessions and not hear a single thing anyone is talking about.
And certainly a lot of young people who have undiagnosed conditions learn that's a good way to stop people harassing them in a class.
Exactly. Like, I once had a buddy of mine, we were in a PD session together. He goes, "You're the head nod guy, so you never get called out." I'm like, But if we ask them or, make them, do one of those 3 things, self-assess, self-reflect, or engage with the learning goals, whether they do it with a smile or a frown, they are engaged. So that's step 1. Make sure that all of your lessons have one of those 3 things. So that's the 3. And then by 2 for the learning, make sure there's 2 ways for them to learn it, ideally in different modes, right? So a video and a text, or an audio, and like something that's read, actual print or, computer screen words, and then something that's, they can listen to. Ideally, the listen to thing would have closed captions, and then you're killing a couple of birds with one stone, so to speak, right? But more than one way. And, I don't know about you all in Australia, but like we're fighting like some pretty hard, like chronic absenteeism here in the States.
Yes.
When you plan 2 of those, especially if one of them is like an audio version, you're also kind of helping navigate when students return from chronic absenteeism. You're not having to be the one to go meet with that kid, because you already did here. Now that kid doesn't get those both options, but that's okay. I mean, because we have a finite amount of time. Like at the end of the day, we just do, right? But it's
like, as you said before, if you're using a platform like Google Classroom or some other LMS, then it's there no matter what. Yeah,
exactly, right. And then same thing for how they demonstrate the learning, right? So ideally, as many ways as possible, 2 ways to share what they're learning, right? The most simplistic, and this is coming from an ELA humanities guy, but it's like you can read it or you can talk it. Now, in a 1 hour or maybe less than an hour, I don't know how much we're going to chat for. I'll stay for 2 or 3 hours, Cameron. Don't worry. But like, we can talk about like, some people say, well, if it's, I've got to write a paper, kids have to write a paper. It's like, well, they do, right? But even there's text to speech options, right? There's all sorts of variables, and like in theory, like write a paper has 3 options to it. I can handwrite it. I can typewrite it, or type it, right? Or I can text to speech it. or
Yep.
sorry, other way around, speech to text it, right? And so like if we do 3, 2, and 2, those three, one of those three in every lesson for engagement, and then 2 ways to learn it, 2 ways to demonstrate it. That's it. I know that may sound overwhelming. I get it. If you're like, if you, especially if you're like joining this podcast and you've never heard of UDL, you're like, what? But I promise you, if you just sit down and just take a moment and breathe, you're probably doing some of that already. And I always say, like, 95% of the teachers that I work with are doing some of this in some ways, in some places. And doing UDL or being a UDL practitioner on the regular is just a matter of doing it all the time with deliberate and intentionality so that it's happening.
Well, I think also it's worth reflecting on how many of those principles have become independent practices that are focused on in parts of education. Like, for example, you're talking about self-assessment, self-reflection, and, you know, a big push in, certainly here where I am in New South Wales, in curriculum delivery at the moment is on, you know, how teachers use learning intentions and success criteria, which is effectively self-reflecting on a goal, self-assessing towards a learning outcome. So, and also the, you know, the multiple modes of representation is a common differentiation strategy as well as a learning design strategy. So these things, I think, and the research behind them have informed independent practices, and people don't often see them as a united whole towards that goal of helping student learning.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I'm blessed to get to work for Novak Ed. One, because Katie's incredible, and the work we're trying to do is so powerful. But while we preach UDL, our actual macro level goal is just more inclusive classrooms. And so, like, that's really what we're trying to do. We're trying to create more equitable learning environments. And so, you know, whether you want to think about it through that lens, but it ties all these initiatives together, right? Like, I've been in districts before. It's like, well, we're doing equity this week, and next week's PD is going to be on DI, and then next week's PD is going to be on learning goals. And then next week's PD is going to be on grading practices. And then we're going to come back to the equity one. And you just keep skipping around all these things. And
Yeah.
to me, the beauty of UDL is that it brings them all together. And so, like, if anyone listening to this right now is someone who has any sort of decision-making power in your school district who oversees PD, like, you don't have to think about these things in isolated ways, and you don't have to do the hard work to make the connections. Just use universal design as the umbrella for inclusive classrooms and increased equity. And if you embrace all of those principles, it's going to happen, because you can't ignore, something such as, equity. When we think about engagement, as an ELA teacher, I can't ignore which books I choose if I'm actually thinking about equitable inclusion for engagement. Because if I don't get the book that gets a kid engaged because they can't see themselves in the characters, so it's not about like, oh, our engagement focus is on, like, more inclusive texts. Sure, but that becomes a one-off. Instead, it's like, no, we're looking at, universal design and removing barriers for engagement, and that would mean, X, Y, and Z. And you could extrapolate to all the sorts of disciplines, how that plays out. So for me, it is the PD focus that does all the other PD foci. I don't know. Does focus become plural there? We'll go ahead and pretend it does, Cameron.
Yeah. Well, on that notion of inclusive classrooms, when we started this conversation, one of the examples you gave was the likelihood that people might have in their class someone with an undiagnosed reading or visual disability, for example, or difficulty. And I'm sure pretty much every teacher will have had the experience of encountering a student who clearly demonstrates behaviors or symptoms of particular learning challenges or difficulties that for whatever reason have gone undiagnosed or unsupported. I think the big three, certainly here in Australia, the big three are usually ADHD, some form of autism spectrum disorder, and some sort of visual or processing difficulty, whether that's dyslexia or some of the more rare versions like dyspraxia or the other things.
Mm-hmm.
How does universal design for learning particularly help those students in the classroom?
Well, I think it helps in two ways. I think it helps the individual student in their learning. And I think it also helps the individual student get a better chance at the right supports that are needed. So let me start on that train. And it kind of goes back to like when we universally design, we get better data to differentiate. It's the same thing with regards to trying to diagnose. Part of universal design's big concept is like it is for improved classroom instruction for all.
Mm-hmm.
And I pardon me, I should have done a little bit more research about the Australian education system. Like here we have like multi-tiered systems of support, so MTSS. And what we think about there is like tier 1 is classroom instruction, tier 2 is the next level of intervention, tier 3 is the most intense, right? How do we know if a kid is ready to go to tier 2 if we haven't removed all the barriers in tier 1? We don't, right? We're guessing. We're saying this kid has a reading diagnosis or has, ADD or ADHD or dyslexia, like, whatever these things might be. And all of those are super, legit, diagnoses and things that our students are struggling with. But as a classroom teacher at the most foundational level, I'll use myself as an example. 10 years ago, I couldn't have gone and talked to someone who works in our special services department with any sort of confidence that I knew what the heck this kid could or couldn't do, other than they failed my reading quizzes, so they must not be able to read, or or their paper was awful because their handwriting and spelling was like whatever it might be, right? Or I actually saw a math student the other day who was trying to like write their answer to a word problem, and the handwriting, and this is high school, the handwriting was just literally illegible. Well, like, so are we saying that that's a processing, concern? Are we saying that's an intellectual, like, did the kid, we just don't know, right? And so when we think about how UDL actually is the framework or the foundation, the bedrock on which whatever you want to call it, again, we call it, MTSS, but whatever sort of multi-tiered or tiered series of support is, unless we've done everything we can to remove as many barriers as possible at the classroom level, those who are then trained to take that data and start to make some accommodations and diagnoses, they don't know what they're accommodating for. Or we don't even know what we're designing that tier 2 curriculum for, because a lot of schools have a second tier of like a support class, for example, right? Like we, where I'm at, we have a math and a reading support class. But if we haven't removed all the barriers from tier 1, what are we supporting? We don't know. We're guessing. And so, when we think about removing those barriers and allowing students to truly demonstrate with as much freedom and support as possible, we talked about this earlier, as much scaffolding as possible, then we can say, okay, like they had multiple graphic organizers and they weren't able to get to X, Y, or Z, or, in the math class, we gave them like the step-by-step like process for the solution of a problem reminders, and they couldn't get to XYZ. Well, then we got to ask ourselves too, well, could they read those reminders? Or did we give them an audio version of those reminders as well, right? Like there's so many more layers to it than we realize before we can get to saying a kid actually has or should be considered for diagnoses X, Y, or Z. And full disclosure, Cameron, like I am not trained as a special educator. My wife is. I work with a bunch of people who are. I adore how deeply they support students in so many different ways. But at the end of the day, I think it's people like me at the classroom tier 1 level, like that just got to be better to help them be better.
Well, that does lead, I suppose, also then to one of the other common myths and pushbacks I hear about UDL, which is the belief that it is more of a it is more of a support for students with learning disability or difficulties, and not a universally or generally applicable framework. How do you respond when you hear that one?
How many curse words can I use? No, I mean, I just think I'll use a mild one. I think it's crap. Like I have no diagnosed and or that I'm even self-aware of learning disabilities that I can think of. I'm lucky, blessed, and feel great about that. It's what it is. This 2 summers ago, I'm working on my doctorate, and I've got to take an a doctoral level ed stats class. Cameron, I needed all the damn help I could get.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I mean, I was drowning in that thing. And you know what? None of it was universally designed. Other than the fact that lectures are recorded, so I could at least go back and watch them, pause them, think, wait, work. But I have no discernible learning disabilities. And I mean,
Yep.
blessed that my wife was also in the class and has like an undergrad in business and math. And so had it not been for that, like I was the quote regular ed kid, or the kid who doesn't have any accommodations, who we don't know is drowning, might get that C, and we might be thinking, good for Johnny, he got a C. And like, but I don't care about my grade. I want to learn the stuff. So I would have gotten a C. I didn't, thanks to my wife being there, but I don't want to see, and I don't care about C. Like, I want to know that I left that class learning that stuff. And you know what? Can I tell you anything about standard deviations right now? I mean, kind of like they're like a thing that moves a curve a little, something along those lines, right? Like I end up with an A in the class, but I can't tell you a single thing I learned. But man, if there were a couple of other ways for me to learn that stuff and to demonstrate my learning other than multiple choice quizzes, might have been a different thing. And I think we all, one of the things I often open workshops with is like, think about a time you struggled to learn something, and what were your chances to demonstrate that learning? And it ends up being like the same thing. Well, it was class X where I learned it through a lecture and I demonstrated it through a test. Well, that has nothing to do with whether our students have special accommodations or not. That's every single learner that we ever work with. And if those are the only two options that they have, we got work to do.
Yeah. No, it's again, I think some of those misconceptions often lead to less effective implementation as well. And so people then create their own sort of evidence of ineffective modeling rather than ineffective implementation.
Yeah, totally.
On that notion of, things being universally designed so that people can engage with it, I think engagement is one of the big challenges. And for a long time, we know that novelty, for example, is a big part of effective learning, that when learners recognize that something is new and novel and interesting. And I think that has, I think maybe the colloquial or even just common use of the word novelty has given people a misunderstanding of what it means to use novelty as an engagement strategy. But I think it's also kind of affected the way people understand engagement generally. So when we talk about the strategies for engagement, and to use your example of the stats class and not feeling like you had a clear sense of where to go, what are some of the ways and some of the strategies embedded within UDL that help engage students, even if it's not necessarily content they're personally interested in, but then also that give them a clear sense of their place and role in the learning, to overcome that engagement barrier?
Yeah. Well, for me, when I think about my engagement work, I fall back on the work of Castle, which is an organization that is dedicated to social emotional learning. And I think social emotional learning is a beautiful thing that sometimes gets a bad rap. Um, what it's trying to do is teach students how to navigate the ups and downs of life, not just
Mm.
make them feel good about everything all the time. But we hear social, like if I could like wave a magic wand and go back and like get that term rebranded, I would like take the emotion out of it, because teachers hear emotion and they're like, I'm not here to teach kids to feel good about themselves. Well, first I'm like, well, why wouldn't you? But
Mm.
yeah, that's a whole other thing, right? So what Castle as an organization says is that we're trying to teach 5 skills: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and decision making. So if we're doing those 5 things, it doesn't matter if you do or don't like what we're learning. You still should have a reason to engage, right? So like if you don't like the concept, but I'm teaching you social awareness, part of that, and self-management, part of that is to self-manage. Yeah, this isn't my thing, but I'm being called on to interact in a social setting with others to engage in a way that makes sense and is meaningful, right? Like as adults, I think generally speaking, we do that often, right? Like, I mean, whether it's something as simple as like picking where we go to dinner, right? Like, man, personally, if I never had Mexican food again, I'd be okay in life. My wife loves it, right? So, from a self management standpoint, I'm aware of that. And from a relationship skills standpoint, I'm also well aware that every once in a while we should be having Mexican food to keep her happy, right? Very simple example. But when we think about it through the lens of teaching skills, and not just thinking about it as like, how do I make a kid happier, or how do I make a kid want to like this more? Because you know what, at the end of the day, if a kid isn't liking X, Y, or Z, we're probably not going to make them like it. But can we create learning conditions that make learning about it more enjoyable and have fewer
Mm.
barriers? Right, like that's the key. We're like, at the end of the day, they're like, my brother is one of the most brilliant human beings I've ever met. High school degenerate though, like barely graduated, got into fights, like all those sorts of things. He now travels the country doing like home audio and video install for like celebrities. Like, dude is like brilliant. Like, there was nothing that any English teacher was going to do that made him like Shakespeare.
Mm.
He didn't
Mm.
give a damn about a sonnet. Right? But if we created environments in which he had to at least be self aware of that fact and navigate the relationship skills around talking with others who maybe did care about that, we start to create learning environments that I think can have some productivity and some engagement that would change someone like my brother, for example, Eric. I love you to death. I'm going to give you that shout out. He knows I use him as an example all the time, so it's okay. But like, it just changes what our focus is, and it's like, our yes, I hope my infectious love of the sonnet is enough to get everyone to want to, but it's not, right? Or the math teacher's like infectious love for the quadratic formula. Like, I'm going to teach this with so much passion that it's going to work. And you know what? For a vast majority of kids in a lot of schools, it will. But in a lot of places, and for a lot of kids, and the kids that need the support the most, it's not. And so I think when we rely on something like the Castle, like those 5 skills, and we start to make it about teaching how to self manage, how to be self aware, how to be socially aware, how to make decisions, we can change the game a little bit.
Mm. Mm. And the other thing that connects to that in my mind that you've talked about already is the the principle of teaching for mastery, or for students to master the content. And when I think of mastery, both whether as a mastery goal orientation or mastery learning, the idea of increasing independence comes into that. And the general sort of term used in psychology is executive function, and the ability, as you were saying, to self-regulate, be self-aware. How does, in working towards that mastery of content and mastery learning, how does UDL particularly support that development as well?
Yeah, I mean, when we're trying to work towards that mastery learning piece, right? Like that's one of the three principles. I think mastery learning or mastery learning paired with being expert learners, right? So UDL says we want to create students who are expert learners, meaning they know best how they learn best, in which ways they learn best, in which context they need to learn. I know it's kind of a lot to follow, right? But that's what we're trying to do. So if we can accomplish that, we can then string that over towards mastery learning in any setting, right? I mean, Cameron, like, think about yourself as a learner, right? Like, do you study or learn the same way in an algebra class as you would in a music theory class or right? But we as adults, especially adults who work in education, who have studied educational theory, like, we get that. We've learned how we learn. How are we matriculating that down to even our kindergartners and asking, a kindergartner, would you rather, listen to this by yourself or with another friend? Just these small little moves of giving these, like, I know I always say, like, I talk in high school because I live in high school. But like, we can carry this down, right? Like, I was with my nephews this weekend, and one of them is the two that I was, like, kind of chatting with. Like, one was is 6, and one is 8. And I asked them a question. I was like, well, like, what are your thoughts? And the one kid was kind of like struggling to kind of put together verbally their thoughts, and I knew he was an artist, and I was like, draw me something. Done. There it was. And like, so it can be that small. It just needs to be that deliberate.
Right. So then, just to help bring all of these threads together, can you give us an example from your own classroom of what effective UDL looks like in practice?
Yeah. So my favorite example that I like to use is when I am trying to teach students to think about, when they're writing their own narratives, what point of view they should choose, or when they're writing their own stories, what point of view they should choose. And I know not everyone listening to this is an English teacher by any means, but we all understand story because that's how humans learn. And we all understand point of view because we're adults. So I like to use this example. And so to attack the engagement barrier, what I did was, one, I just labeled it "Who Lives, Who Dies, Who Tells Your Story," which is a reference to Hamilton, which, and I created this when it was at its peak of peaks, right? So like that automatically, like, kids were like, "Ooh, it's Hamilton," right? And then this is a big UDL move that I want to make sure that we talk about. So I'm glad you asked me to, kind of share an example. So then from there, I asked students, there are 2 required resources they have to explore. And then there are 5 other options that they have to choose 1 or 2 more of. And that's a big UDL move, right? It's like, I know everyone has to look at this. And looking at this might be your lecture. Totally awesome, right? For me, the 2 pieces they have to look at, one is a TED Talk. It's the TED Talk about the danger of a single story.
Yes, we use that one a lot here as well.
Yeah. Beautiful story, right? We're seeing diverse voices coming into play there as well. We're using a TED Talk, which from an engagement standpoint is breaking down some barriers. From a how they learn standpoint, I can use closed captioning. So they've got video, they got audio, they've got the text there. There's very few barriers to that particular resource. Then the second one that they have to look at is also a video, which also has closed captioning, but it's Lin-Manuel Miranda himself talking about how he hears characters in his head. And so now we're connecting it to the theme. After the title and those 2, like, generally speaking, I feel like I've done a pretty good job of breaking down engagement barriers. For the most part, kids are pretty into it. And I've also broken down how they learn, because everyone has had access to the 2 things I need them to have access to. And then from there are 5 other resources that they can choose from. And they range, again, because I'm trying to break down like how they learn barriers. There's like one blog, there's a visual, there's all different methods that they can, to get into it. And then for how they demonstrate to try and remove those barriers, they can write me their pitch of what point of view their story is going to be told from and why, or they can use Flipgrid or any other audio, recording device to talk me through what their, point of, or they can just come see me and just chat with me. But they have a written and a verbal place to do that. So real quick, that's a one lesson. That could be a 1-day thing. But that's another place too, where like working with a teammate's great, because like building that resource bank of, essentially that was 7 resources, the 2 that they had to do and the other 5, that can go a lot faster. But you also wouldn't need all those 5. You could have do those 2, or even just one of those 2 is required, and then just 2 more. Mine have grown over the years as if you're, looking to become, more immersed in UDL. I hope yours will too. Like every year I'll add in or I'll replace or those sorts of things. So that's just a quick little example of what that looks like.
And how did you find, having run that lesson, I'm guessing a couple of times at least, how did you find the student engagement and achievement in that design?
Yeah, I mean, without being, like too arrogant, I guess. I mean, it was fantastic. They had a blast. Kids were chatting about both of the TED Talks, especially like getting to hear. I mean, there's a lot of students who are out there like Google searching how Lin-Manuel Miranda created some of these characters, but they also know the show. At least a lot of them do, right? And also I think it's really important. I work in a predominantly white school too. We're 80%, 70, 75% white, something like that. But I thought it was really important for the 2 required texts to be, authors of and writers and creators of color, and for all of the students to be able to see that. And I think, the students of the color that are in my class, while not a lot of them, I think they were really appreciative of that. There was great, like, authentic conversation. Like I didn't have to create discussion questions. Like kids just wanted to talk with each other about like what they just saw, which I think is really, for me, oftentimes how I'll gauge engagement. It's one metric of many, so I don't want this to get like blown out of proportion. But if I hear students talking about things that they are trying to learn without me prompting them, I feel like I've done pretty well, at least in terms of the first step.
Now, you and I both come from English teaching backgrounds. So, I know that we've centered a little bit of the conversation there. In your work with schools and more broadly as a consultant in this field, have you seen, or can you give any examples of what this has looked like in, say, a maths classroom or a science classroom or different teaching contexts?
Yeah, one of my favorite UDL examples was removing barriers for how students demonstrate learning around a math test. It was brilliant, and I depending on how much time I want to spend, I can give a couple of examples, but this one in particular was so super cool. When we talk about like all of those castle strategies around like self-awareness and self-management and like demonstrating their learning, this teacher had a test. And it was in a grad class that I was teaching around UDL, and we were in the assessment unit. And I'm not a test fan. I'll just go ahead and say it. And this teacher was like, "I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you I can UDL a test." I'm like, "Please do, because I'll steal your example." and this, for as successful as you can be, I think this teacher was. So here's what this teacher did. They broke down, and this comes back to firm goals, flexible means, which is one of like guiding principles of UDL. The test had 4 standards or goals, 4 questions per goal. Okay. And when the students came into the room, they didn't even notice this, but they sat down to take the test. And in the 4 corners of the room were like butcher block paper taped up on the walls. Okay. And it was like on one of them was 1 through 4. The next one was 5 through 9. The next one was 10 through, I'm bad at math, 13 or 4, whatever it would be. The 4 standards, 1 standard on each poster. And students started their test, working. And with about 20 minutes to go in the test, 15 minutes to go in the test, teacher said, "Okay, I'm going to pause for a second. And I'm going to ask you to think about which of and the questions weren't in order. So they had tackled at least a question from each of the 4 standards at this point,
Mm-hmm.
if that makes sense conceptually, right? Like
Yep.
they had to wrestle with each of the learning goals. I'm going to pause. And if you look around the room, each learning goal is on a piece of the paper. And there was a problem, like a math equation, on each piece of paper. It wasn't one from the test, but it was one that was part of that standard. And so then the teacher said, go to the corner that has the standard that you're struggling with the most and go and work on that problem with your classmates. I'm going to give you about 5 minutes. Then you can come back and we'll finish up the test. So kids would go to they're like, oh my God, this standard 2, I am so lost on. So, 6 of us are huddled in the corner of standard 2 and we're working on that equation. And we're like, no, wait, I totally remember in class, he said, you absolutely have to multiply first, or you absolutely have to the number outside of the parentheses is carried through. I'm kind of vaguely using math terms right now, right? So we talk about self-awareness and self-reflection, right? Which one am I struggling with the most, right? Collaborative, relationship skills, working together. Then they went back to the test and they got to finish up the test. Simple. Really simple. Now you've got to create a good test that's standards aligned, though, too. I mean, that's not as simple.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah. And I think that part of the learning design is often something that is challenging as well, that doesn't necessarily get factored in as much as it should do.
Right.
Yeah. Well, that's a fascinating example. And I can imagine it might take people a bit of thinking to wrap their head around disrupting a sort of test environment in that way. And yet recognizing the benefits of that kind of collaborative learning, even in that context.
Well, and I'm not a mathematician, but I don't think that there are many people who work in a field that requires a mathematician's mind who are doing it in complete isolation. NASA's not building a rocket ship with one guy. At least I hope not.
Yes. Yes, and yet most of our education systems do still have one student, one test, one result for purposes other than learning.
Correct. So I liked that example. It's just a quick little one from a different discipline because I know we've ELA heavied it tonight, but yeah.
Well, look, Chris, thank you very, very much for your time, for your evening. I really appreciate you taking the time for this conversation. The organization is Novak Education, and as you mentioned before, the series of books are broadly under the title UDL Now. And as you say, there's so many covering different topics. I'm currently working my way through UDL in the cloud because I'm currently working in an online school.
Awesome.
And finding that very, very useful. So thank you very much for your time once again. I'll make sure there's links to your profile and to those websites in the show notes. And thank you for taking us on this guide through UDL in this interview.
Thanks for having me. Cheers, everyone.